All right, welcome. Today we're going to talk a little bit about critical thinking and how it plays into success in both nursing and science. In order to get to nursing, you got to pass your science courses first. So even if you're not interested in nursing, but you're interested in something else that needs science, today's for you. And if you just want to be a better thinker in life, we can also talk about that. So the first thing is, what do we mean by critical thinking? And there's a lot of different things that can be meant. So we're going to go over a couple of those aspects today. But one of the most important things in terms of your success here in science and in nursing is what we call the Bloom's Taxonomy of learning. Now, has anyone here ever heard of that before? Well, if you had, I'd be scared. So in high school, a lot of times, what you were asked to do was memorize a bunch of stuff and then spit it back on the test. And that is what we call the lowest level of learning, is basically recall. You're memorizing and you're spitting back, like a little miniature robot. Now, some of you are really good at that, and some of you are terrible at it. But that's not what you need in order to be successful in college science. So the next step along the way in Bloom's taxonomy was something we call comprehension. Do you understand the material? And so in this case, you need to be able to explain the material. So it's not just about memorizing it and recalling it. It's about, well, what does it mean? How does it interact? What are the parts? Then our next level of learning is something that we call analysis. So that would be, you've got a patient with a potassium level of 3.0. What sorts of symptoms would you expect to see in that patient? Or here's a list of symptoms, which of them are being caused by that potassium level? So now you're having to put lots of things together in order to figure out what's going on. And then the last step is something we call synthesis, is where you're putting multiple things together. So you'd say, well, here's your patient with that 3.0, and here's the case history. And now you have to figure out why they have the low potassium in the first place. How many of you ever had this happen to you? You're studying. This is good. I got it. I got this. You get to the test, and your first question, you're like, I do not got this. What happened? You read it. You thought you got it. Why didn't you really get it? Because you really didn't understand it. So the very first step in going beyond mere memorization, here's the other problem. I want you to memorize these 5 numbers. 5, 6, 10, 11, 12, 37. Got it? Yeah, some of you actually got it. How many of you will remember those numbers an hour from now? Nobody. Why? Because it's meaningless. So the very first step in really memorizing is to put meaning into that memorization. Does that make sense? The second step is to work with the material to actually truly understand it. The best way to do that is to talk about it or write about it. So one of the things that you need to do is break your studying up into about 10-minute chunks. After studying for 10 minutes, you stop and you ask yourself, what have I learned? And then from there, you're going to have to tell yourself. So you can do that a couple ways. One is by writing it down. If you're going to write it down, I would highly suggest that you write a blog. Then you can do a couple things. One is you can look back at it. 2, you can share it with anyone you want in the world. And 3, you can show your parents how smart you are. So if you're going to write it down, I'd suggest using a blog. The other thing is that you probably won't lose your blog, whereas you might lose your notes. How many of you ever lost your notes? It was the end of your world. Another way to do it is to talk about it. And if you're going to talk about it, then I'd suggest recording yourself. How many of you have an iPhone or an Android? Oh, it's everyone together, right? So you can record yourself into your phone, and then you've got notes that you can listen to while you're exercising, and so you can study while you're walking around. You listen to yourself instead of your boring professor. Isn't that much better? But I hate the way I sound. Nothing's perfect. You could also take out your phone, make little YouTube videos. Yeah. How many of you want to be Insta famous? Come on, raise your hands. I know you do. Yeah. You want to know how successful YouTubers and Instagrammers become successful? They do it. Now, how many times a day should you be, how many times a week should you be studying for science type material? every day. So what if instead of doing like 6 hours or 12 hours right before the test, you did 20 minutes each day? I don't know if that actually works out in math, but what if you did each day, and at the end of your little study session, you recorded a 3-minute video and posted it on YouTube and Instagram? You'd probably be rich by the time you graduated from here and never have to work as a nurse. But hey, that's not the story that we're trying to sell today. The story we're trying to sell today is that the act of recording yourself, the act of talking the material, helps you to understand it in a way you didn't before. How many of you, just the first time you did everything in life, were good at it? Nobody? Nobody is just naturally gifted at everything? Imagine if some of you approached walking the way that you want to approach your sciences. You fail your first test. That's it. I'm out of here. I'm going to withdraw from this. I'm no good. I'm just obviously no good at science. Well, imagine we approached walking that same way. Kid pulls himself, falls right down. Well, that kid sucks at walking. He's never going to walk. Just stop trying. Don't walk anymore. What would happen? Kid would never ever walk, right? Just because he was bad at walking when he first started, does that mean he can't do it? Or does it mean he needs to practice and develop? So if you want to be good at science, if you want to be good at thinking, what do you have to do? You have to practice. So every 10 minutes while you're studying, you stop. What have I learned? Either write it down in your own words or say it out loud. And as long as you're saying it, you might as well record yourself and put it on YouTube so you can be Insta-famous. That doesn't work. YouTube famous. Does that make sense? So when it comes to that critical thinking, a lot of it is our desires. If you approach biology as, oh my gosh, this is dreadful, I hate it, this is so scary, you're not going to enjoy it. If you approach it as, this is the gateway to success in nursing, I'm excited about this because this is how the foundation of how the body works. And I'm fascinated because it's just cool. You're probably going to be more successful being the same person, but just having that different attitude. Now, I haven't really told you that much about what critical thinking is because it's not as important what it is as what you do to obtain it. And what's the most important thing to do to obtain it? Doing it, practicing it. We can call that studying, but the most important part about studying is not the input of time. What's the most important thing about studying? It's the input of meaning. What does this material mean to me? Because if it's meaningless to you, there's only one person in the room who's going to remember it. Everyone else, a bunch of meaningless numbers I don't even remember him saying. Same thing with the material that you're learning. It's not just memorizing it, it's what does it mean? And if you can take that in a management course, in a business course, in elementary education, whatever it is, you're going to be vastly more successful than if you just, oh, this is so dumb, this is so boring, I can't believe I'm doing this. I'd rather be doing something else. Even if you're like, I'm dedicated because I am an A student. I always make A's. I will learn this material. Learn the material. You're still not going to be as successful as someone who can make it meaningful for them. Because in that meaning, really, I mean, what's important? What you learned for the test or what you remember 5 years from now? Which is more important? What you remember 5 years from now, right? So if you think about it from that perspective, you're going to be a lot more successful in terms of all of your studying. Now, I just need to mention a couple aspects of critical thinking that might be helpful, just understanding what they are. So the first one is what we call self-regulation. Self-regulation is the ability to reflect on what's happening and change your own behavior. And really, I think this is probably the number one most important when it comes to studying. How many of you had your first test yet? Yeah, it's week 4. You start to have your first test. You probably get your grades back next week. If you don't do well on that first test, should you keep doing the exact same thing you were doing for the first test? Probably not going to be successful. So the tests and the professors don't change. So what has to change? You. What you do has to change. So you have to decide how effective what you're doing is. That's called self-regulation. Another one is called analysis. So analysis is basically breaking things down and thinking about things. That is the most difficult one we talked about earlier on, and that is a skill that you have to build up to. So in Biology 1, you're not doing that much analysis. You're mostly doing recall and comprehension, a little bit of application. Once you get into anatomy and physiology and microbiology, you're going to be doing more application and analysis, and so you have to build on what you have already learned in Bio 1 and chemistry. So that one is the thing that most takes time, and you just have to go through that process we talked about earlier. And then another one is validation. So when you receive information, you have to ask, how valid is this information? And here is one of the places where students get into trouble. Because almost all of us would prefer to talk to our friends instead of a professor. So instead of finding out, I get emails like this all the time. My friends and I were having this big discussion, and everyone is confused about blah, 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 blah. They're like, well, why are you having this big discussion and confused about it? Because if you look in the notes, it tells you the right answer right there. Oh. So let me ask you this question. If the correct answer was right on the PowerPoint slide that they have a copy of, did they need to engage in argument? No. So why were they engaging in argument? Because they didn't have valid information. So what do they need to do? They need to seek validation. Now, here is a crazy, crazy thought. Your textbook probably has a lot of correct information in it. So when you're confused and you don't understand things, they even have electronic textbooks where you can do a keyword search and it'll tell you every place the word you're looking for occurs. There's also a table of contents and index for those of us who are more old-fashioned. So that would be a fantastic place to start. Going back to asking your professor. Rather than preface it with, my friends and I are all confused. Preface it with, I wasn't sure about this. I looked it up in the book and it says this, but I'm still not sure about that. What does that just tell the professor? It tells them that you're with it enough to actually open a textbook. It tells them you're intelligent enough to know that you're not sure, and you're smart enough to ask them instead of your friends. How do you like that? So some of this is professor hacking, and the dirty secret for a lot of tests is the grading is somewhat subjective. So would you prefer that they not know you at all, or would you prefer that they think of you as, oh, that's the smart person? When they grade your answer, who do you think they're going to grade slightly easier? Oh, the smart person or the person who failed last time and never came to see me? Who's going to get graded harder? Yeah. So you're setting yourself up for success psychosocially as well as mentally by engaging in these thinking exercises. Now, let's also just talk for a moment about cramming. All-nighters. That's the way to do it. You just wait until the last moment, and then you don't sleep that night, because when you sleep, your brain throws away everything that you learned. Well, that is kind of true, but here's the thing. When you go to sleep at night and you dream, even if you don't remember the dream, what your brain is doing is it's trying to make sense of what you've been doing that day. How many have ever played a repetitive phone game? Whatever, one of those match 3 in a row type games. If you play it enough, what will happen when you go to sleep? You actually start dreaming about the game, right? Your brain is like, okay, this is really important to you, so I got to make sense of it. And you actually start to have dreams about that. When you go to sleep at night and you dream, your body's trying to process information. And if you memorize those numbers that I said earlier, but then you never use them again, after 3 or 4 nights sleep, guess what happens to those numbers? Completely gone. But what if you remembered those numbers and you said them out loud 5 times a day for a week? Do you think your brain would throw away those numbers? Not for a longer time, right? So when you cram for a test and you pass the test and then you go, thank God, done with that, and you go to sleep that night, guess what happens? Your brain goes, not important. And then when you go to learn the next subject, guess what's no longer in your head? That stuff that you crammed for. So now you're learning more meaningless things that don't have the context of what you had already learned because you forgot it. And so it makes it harder to study that next part. And so over time, it's harder and harder and harder because you're not getting enough sleep between study sessions. So it's better to study 1 hour for 6 days than it is to study 6 hours in one day, probably even 8 hours in one day. The other thing is, how many of you can study for 8 hours in a day? Or is it really, a little bit of social media, a little bit of talking with my friends, a little bit of goofing off, a little bit of daydreaming, and some studying too. So if you try and study for 8 hours in a row, how much of that is truly effective studying?
Like 2 hours.
If you're lucky. But if you study for 1 hour, how much of that time might be effective studying? 45 minutes? Chances are more of that time will be good. The other thing is, if you only study for an hour instead of 8 hours, you actually have more time to have fun the rest of the time. Oh, no, you don't understand, Dr. Heyman. I had fun this entire week. I only had to give up one day. You want me to give up a little bit of every day. I don't think I can do that. Well, you have to ask yourself, how successful do you want to be? And that, going again to your future self, what does your future self look like? All right, get out of here.